Um, cool. Thank you, Vanessa. Um, all right, great. So yeah, again, welcome to Media Power Collaboratives, building narrative power to change local news. So a quick review of the agenda. First, we're going to get a chance to do some intros. You're going to get a chance to have a quick kind of breakout with other folks in this space just to introduce yourself and say hi. Then we're going to be sharing some case studies of some work that Free Press has done using narrative power to change local news. And we're going to share 3 different case studies, one from Philadelphia, one from New Jersey, and another from our Media 2070 project. And then for the majority of our time, we're going to be breaking out into small groups where we're going to be able to kind of discuss how we can apply these skills, do some brainstorming, do some kind of scenarios and things like that. And then we'll come back to the full group, get a chance to share that, and some sharebacks, and then we'll close. This is going to be running until 2:30 Eastern, so it's a little bit longer than our normal ones, but we wanted to make sure that we had enough time today to really dig into stuff. So again, thank you all for joining today. I already had a chance to introduce this awesome team, but again, I'm Mike Rispoli from Free Press, and I'm here with my colleagues Alicia, Vanessa, and Diamond, who are going to be sharing today as well. So before we get started, this is always like a great time for us to meet one another so that you're not just hearing from us, but that you're hearing from the community that you're a part of. So we're going to get into breakout groups and introduce yourself to other participants. We just ask that you share your name, pronouns, affiliation, where you're from, and just a quick prompt. What's the soundtrack to your life right now? We heard some great tunes coming in here today, but we'd love to hear from you and have you all share what's the soundtrack to your life right now. And so we'll break out just for a couple of minutes and then we'll come back to the full group to get started.
All right, I opened up the breakout rooms. So if you see an invitation, please accept it. And if you have any problems, just let me know. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to meet some friends.
Yep.
All right, looks like everybody is coming back now into the fold. Okay, great. We're going to continue with the presentation. It was nice to hear folks soundtrack to their lives. Definitely some unexpected stuff came up in our groups. Feel free to put in the chat your favorite soundtrack that you heard. I know a member of my group talked about bagpipes, which is super awesome. So go ahead and light that chat up when you get a chance. So now we're going to get into narrative power. And I got to say, this is not an intensive course on narrative power. It's taken us many workshops and many years of practicing narrative power to get a handle on it. And we're still learning. So if folks have more experience with narrative power, please share resources and tips in the chat. This is really just an introduction for folks that maybe are not as familiar with it. Obviously, as journalists, we're always telling stories and using narratives to communicate the voices of the people that we're interviewing and the communities that we're covering. But we're talking about narrative power as an advocacy tool to advocate for better journalism, for better newsrooms, for funding for local journalism, for more diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in full disclosure, I'm president of my Philly chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and we employ narrative power pretty frequently when we're talking about the need for more hashtag more Latinos in news. So some of you might be part of other organizations, professional organizations, where you had some experience in this. So by all means, this is interactive and we'll be sharing. And later on, we'll be getting into groups to practice this type of storytelling. So for folks don't know, narrative power is the long-term effect of advancing, establishing, and defending narratives through a variety of strategies and tactics. And so when we think about narratives, it's really made up of a group of stories that build a dominant narrative. And so let's take a minute to think about what is the dominant narrative that we're seeing right now about local news? What is the thing that people keep repeating? It may or may not be true, but it is the thing that we see most commonly. So if you want to take a minute and put something in the chat. I see a skull across. Well, narrative power also does involve imagery and art. So if that is related to that. But as you think about that question, narrative strategy is a tool to advocate for ourselves, right? It combats misinformation and disinformation. And so we think about what is the story or collection of stories we tell to advance our mission. Yeah, and one of the things is like local news is dying, right? Right, here I'd see, here we get some more tropes. It's basically non-existent or decimated. Local news doesn't tell positive stories, right? And has been co-opted by more political organizations. Yeah, exactly. And these narratives come from a variety of different places. They can come from journalists and people working in the journalism space themselves. They come from politicians, right? Like the media lies, fake news. And it can also come from communities, right? So people who are maybe checked out of mainstream media or consuming local news, either because it doesn't appeal to them or because their communities are not being covered or being covered incorrectly, or they might have had a negative experience with media. So I see here, people don't care about local news, right? So these are all the stories that make up the dominant narrative about local news being in some sort of trouble, right? Hence the needing to save it. So narrative power is also the power to dictate norms and values in society. So the framing of a narrative is intentional and a strategic choice, determining who is in and who is out of the stories we tell and the approaches we propose. So it's important for social movements to introduce their own framing. Again, you might have heard this before, because if we don't tell our own stories, others will create them for us. And so you can check out resilience.org. They have a really great article about building narrative power as a tool for advocacy, which I'll drop in the chat in a minute. But one of the things that we're constantly doing at Free Press is sharing information from communities, right? So when we do community listening sessions, town halls, information needs assessments, one-on-ones, and we participate in focus groups with communities, we're constantly getting data, right? Or stories that people are telling that often contradicts what these dominant narratives say. And one of those things is people actually do care about local news and they want it and need it. And there actually is a lot of really great local journalism that is being created across the country that actually does empower people and gives them useful information. And so having that data, that feedback allows us to tell the story about local journalism, why it's important, why we need to fund it, and why we need to organize to get something better. So some of the questions that we ask when we're building a narrative is, what are the stories that we can tell that can liberate us? And so one of the tropes or things that we often say is that we need local news for an effective democracy, right? We see what happens when we don't have access to local media and journalists who are covering city government and local government issues. It can lend itself to undemocratic processes and laws and policies that can be oppressive. And so again, we often talk about the importance of local journalism and why we need it for democracy. Who is in the story? So again, who are the actors in the story? Again, we can talk about it from the perception of journalists, right? Because many of us here are journalists or work in newsrooms. Or we can talk about it from the perspective of community, which is often what Free Press does, because we align ourselves with community members who are organizing to get better media. But more often than not in the press, you've seen a lot of media company leaders talk about journalism, right? As they're advocating for laws and bills that might give funding to places that are cutting jobs and not really doing a good job of providing journalism that speaks to people's needs. So those are all the different kinds of people that can be centered in the story that we tell. Right now, you know, text is not so resonant with people anymore. We live in a multimedia environment, and we're seeing a really big rise of social media and apps like TikTok and YouTube and WhatsApp, reaching entirely different new audiences that weren't in the past. And so when we're building narrative power, we also want to be thinking about what images, sounds, art, data, poetry, or evidence can we be sharing in order to tell the story and demonstrate our vision. And again, we know how viral videos can be, or memes. I mean, I love memes to make my point. I feel like memes convince a lot of people because people resonate with humor, right? And so again, we can't just be writing reports or writing comments. We have to find other ways to tell the story and reach people in a way that makes them empathize or want to believe this as the dominant story or narrative. And Diamond, who's on our Media 2070 team, can really speak to this. It's like, and she will later on when she talks about the case study, how are we using imagination and creativity to resonate with people? Media 2070, for those who are unfamiliar, is an essay written by Free Press, all about what media can look like in 2070 when reparations are paid and when Black people have ownership of the media and resources are abundant. And so Alicia Bell, who is one of the ideators of Media 2070, really pushed our organization and the field at large to make us use our imagination more, hence 2070, right? Thinking into the future of what that world will look like and what it will smell like and what will the sounds be. And so there's been a lot of activities that we've employed in the last 3 years since we launched 2070, Media 2070, to get people to be more imaginative as they tell that story. We also have a platforms team at Free Press that works on misinformation and disinformation. This is how a lot of narratives grow, right? We have a whole narrative out there about the election being stolen, for example. That is a narrative that continues to permeate our country's political atmosphere. I don't know if folks watched any of that CNN town hall last night, but that same narrative was brought up again one more time. And so again, it's our job to figure out how do we deconstruct these dominant narratives and debunk these myths and misinformation. I think that Dominion lawsuit was really compelling, right? And providing the evidence to debunk a lot of these myths, showing even that Fox News knew that the story was not true. And so we're constantly trying to hold platform companies accountable for putting out these misinformation and disinformation and working together to create our own stories to overcome some of these really negative and harmful tropes that are being used against our communities. And lastly, I want to talk about storytelling that does not harm our communities. Sometimes, we've even seen like DEI be used against us, right? As something that's very performative, right? That doesn't actually give us an anti-racist newsroom, for example. So we have to be careful in telling these stories and building narrative power in a way that's dignified, that centers the perspectives of impacted communities, that's not performative, and in ways that's actually advancing our cause and liberating us and inspiring us in the process. So if folks have anything to add, feel free to put that in the chat, especially if you've worked on narratives and narrative power building in the past. But that's basically a summary of how we can use narrative power as a tool for advocacy. Right now, we're going to segue into 3 case studies where we're going to be showing you how we organized different groups of people to put forth empowering narrative that is going to help us transform media and journalism across the US. The first one is going to be all about our local work here in Philadelphia. And so we have a News Voices project in Philly called Shift the Narrative, and it's oriented around changing crime and public safety stories. And in the process of organizing with community and other organizations, we started to organically organize with journalists who wanted to work together. And with that, we formed the John Coalition. And John is a slang word in Philly. If you've ever been to Philly, you might have heard it. It's kind of akin to whatchamacallit or thingy-majingy. You can insert John for anything like, hey, bring me that John over there. But it is an acronym for Journalism Accountability Watchdog Network. And so we've had a variety of initiatives with John. But the one that we really rallied around was this campaign called Inquire Do Better. And so the Philadelphia Inquirer is the newspaper of record here in Philadelphia. And John is made up of Free Press, the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Philly chapter, which again, I am a part of, and the Asian American Journalists Association Philly chapter. So we have 4 organizations representing different groups of journalists, and we are all on the same page about wanting more diversity, equity, and inclusion in news, but also wanting anti-racist practices and understanding that public safety and crime coverage is often focused on communities of color. We felt as though a newspaper like the Inquirer was really lacking in having reporters of color, especially Black male journalists, covering those issues. And so it became a real problem when their last Black male journalist left the newsroom. And that was Mensa Dean, who left to go work for the Trace, left the Inquirer without any Black male reporters that weren't covering sports. So they did have a few people working on the sports desk. But when it comes to covering public safety, covering neighborhoods, covering culture, investigations, etc., we did not have any Black male reporters covering those issues. This is extremely problematic when we have people not from that community creating stories and content that's often dehumanizing and continuing to criminalize that community. And so when we first got wind of this, right, we had to really hone in on what's the problem. And so the problem is the Inquirer does not have enough Black male reporters covering local stories. And then you develop a messaging frame, because we decided to act on this, that we weren't going to be silent, and that the 4 groups of ours who had been working together on many different issues would come together and publicly advocate for a change. And so our messaging frame was, we need Black men in newsrooms who can accurately cover stories about Black communities, especially crime and public safety issues. Now, we have to have some sort of evidence. We knew that there were employees there, right? But we need something additional. And lucky for us, shout out to Andrea Wenzel, a professor and doctor at Temple University, conducted an audit of the Inquirer's newspaper content and found that 70% of the people in the stories were white men. The majority of stories were also written by white men for white men. And so this provided the actual data that we needed to bolster our argument. Next came our call to action, right? So what are we going to do about it? Well, we decided to go public this campaign, #InquireDoBetter, and we called on the Inquirer to hire more Black male reporters. Pretty simple and straightforward. And after a lot of agitating and campaigning back and forth on Twitter, and let me tell you, the Inquirer did not respond kindly. They were really pissed off at us. And they actually sent an email that was like really terrible, gaslighting us. And internally, this caused an uproar. But all that doesn't matter, because the result is that the Inquirer has hired 5 more Black male reporters since our campaign, more than any other period of in the last 10 years. And so for us, that was like a pretty big victory. And even though they did not respond kindly to our call to action, and they didn't really want to work with us, they still don't like us. They did the thing that we asked them to do. And so now we have a lot more people in the newsroom. It's still not ideal, right? We still need to continue pressing for more diversity in these newsrooms and more Black men and people of color in general in leadership and editorial positions. But this is a good start, and it just shows, again, direct action gets the goods, which is a favorite thing of mine to say. And we even got an award for this. So here locally in Philly, we have the Pen and Pencil Club. It's a journalist club. They have the Philly News Awards every year. And we won for Best Collaborative Journalism Award. And we're the only group that was nominated that didn't actually like quote unquote write like a news report. We did create content. We did, issue letters and put stuff on our websites, but we weren't necessarily publishing at a media outlet. And so there was all these other collaborative projects that did not win. And I think it's because, people voted, mostly journalists are voting for this thing. And we received so much positive feedback from other journalists who felt like, wow, we've never seen these types of journalism groups come together before. To my knowledge, it's the only coalition like this in the US where you have journalists of color coming together under one mission. And people wanted to see more of this. So they gave us an award. Really excited. So right now I'm just going to kind of get out of this presentation for a minute if I can. Hold on. And I'm just going to show you some stuff. So the first thing is this is a letter, and I'll drop this link in the chat for folks who want to check it out. Oh, that is not the link. Okay, so this is one of the first times we came together, and you see this is back in 2020. And we sent it to Lisa Hughes, the publisher of the Inquirer, and to the Lenfest Institute that owns the Inquirer. And we wrote a whole letter, right? And these are some of the things that we talked about, right? That what is the story we tell about local journalism? And you can see here that one of the first things we say is that local journalism is critical to civic engagement and the overall health of our communities, right? And so that's a value statement that we believe in. The second thing is we urge the Inquirer to work with local residents to implement a community-first approach that would enable the newsroom to actively engage with the public and build genuine relationships that center community perspectives. And so those are the two value statements that we're really operating from that kind of led to all this other stuff. I'm not going to go through the whole letter. I'm going to skip to the end because this is the organizing part. And these are all the local organizations that we got to sign on to this letter. And then a bunch of individuals. So you see there's a lot. And so this letter led to the Inquirer engaging with us. So again, talk about narrative power and how does it manifest? It manifests in letters like this. Also, when that diversity audit came out from Temple, we also responded, right? So this is a joint statement from our different chapters about the audit. And this is again, where we had to make a statement about, our reaction to the report, saying that the Inquirer, the people featured in the Inquirer were overwhelmingly white and male. And so again, we talk about harm here. The Inquirer has a responsibility to cover communities of color fairly and consistently. So again, we're tying all these things together. All of us signed here. Then we have the Inquirer. Well, that's not what I wanted to show you, that ad. But here, Ernest Owens is the president. We tweeted a bunch of different things, so you can kind of search Inquirer Do Better. But, we're standing in solidarity. We want equitable practices, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, this is where we put our statements. Free press. Then after that, the Inquirer responded very negatively. So at Free Press, we issued a press release. Coalition of Journalism Groups of Color respond to Philadelphia Inquirer publishers' gaslighting of their membership. And so it was, again, not friendly to what we were saying. But again, we go back to our main messaging points. The Inquirer has 0 Black male news reporters apart from its sports desk. Again, our evidence, the diversity audit, and we continue with the quotes from the different leaders, right? Which we're all kind of, in line with one another. So I'll put this in the chat if it's not in there. And I'll read the statement from Tahid Chappelle, who also works with us on the News Voices team. To be a true anti-racist institution, the Inquirer should proactively work with diverse organizations And remember, these organizations accurately reflect the true demographics of Philadelphia, communities and people the Inquirer needs support from if it wishes to survive in a city that's as a so-called public benefit corporation, right? So again, we're holding them to that. I think that's the last one. So in conclusion, when we use narrative power, and these stories that we tell to create an overarching narrative, it can be used for local organizing campaigns like this. And so again, if there is a newsroom that you feel is not representing the community, is locking out journalists of color or other groups, maybe there's no accommodations for people with disabilities, maybe there's no Indigenous or LGBT representation, maybe the leadership completely lacks diversity, maybe there's pay inequity. We use narratives to build power, to organize, to achieve some sort of change. And I'm happy to say that we were able to get this small win for the Inquirer. But like I said, the work is never ending. We're still pushing them to do better. So right now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Mike, to talk about the Civic Information Consortium.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I think what we're going to do, because I was just chatting with Diamond, I think what we're going to skip over the case studies from Diamond and I, just so we have enough time to do some breakouts. But what I would say, just in following up to what Vanessa said, is that this was like a really good example about how like storytellers, journalists, were formulating a narrative around a problem in their city and then going to people in positions of power to put some pressure on them to make a change. In this case, it was something that, you know, wound up being kind of, you know, us kind of making, you know, some demands of the Inquirer. There's lots of ways that you can use narrative power. Sometimes you can use it with lawmakers. Other times you can do it in a collaborative way with funders or other newsrooms in your community. And so there's lots of ways to use narrative power in order to kind of advance whatever your mission is in changing local news at the local level. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass it over to Leash, who's going to walk us through what the breakout activity is, and we'll get you all kind of into a situation where you all can be thinking about how you're going to use narrative, how you can use narrative power in your community. So I'll pass it to you, Leash.
Okay, thanks so much, Vanessa, for going into that, like, yeah, just showing what it can look like to kind of take narrative from like through a full cycle almost, if you will. And it's time for us to practice, right? Let's see. So Vanessa, do you mind going to the next slide? All right, so we're gonna do this old school in a Google document in groups in just a second. We're going to build a narrative together, and to do that, we're giving y'all a worksheet that has kind of these options for you. On the left, you see these questions that will help guide you to brainstorm or really just play with, like it's less of a brainstorm, it's more of a playing with these 5 kind of bullet points. One is, you know, problem, naming the problem. The second is thinking about a target audience. The third is thinking about who does this problem impact, the needs and solutions possibly, and then a call to action. And we're going to give y'all, I mean, these are suggested audiences, right? Like Mike was talking about newsroom leadership, talking to funders, talking to legislators, that consider these pieces that you can draw from as you kind of work with this in your groups. So let's see. Oh, and then the final thing we're going to offer is we're just like offering 5 different potential issues for you to start from, so you don't have to begin totally from scratch. If something else speaks to your group, feel free to go for it. But for now, I am going to drop a link in the chat. Oh, here we go. Give me just one moment.
I'm going to share it on the screen here.
Oh, thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, and make this a little bit bigger so you can see.
Yeah, there you go, our very fancy Google document. So yeah, there, you've got the instructions in there. got the second paragraph are 5 potential issues that y'all can choose from to kind of play with when thinking about the narrative that you might want to create together. The third are those 3 suggested target audiences, although feel free to pick a different one if it speaks to you. And then, yeah, we gave each group a space. And that's, I mean, the rest is, you know, lovely Google document.
So you can just fill in underneath here. And up top, if you want to put your group members' names. And yeah, just bullet points or whatever. You don't have to write a whole essay here. And then at the end, we're going to come together and you're going to pitch your thing. So imagine you have 2 minutes to talk to your target, to tell them about this problem. How would you present that information? And so we know at conferences, sometimes we run into people between sessions. Mike and I, when we were in Trenton, trying to talk to legislators about the civic information bill, we're literally chasing them down a hallway as they went to their meetings to try to talk to them about that issue. Or you might be in an elevator with somebody for 2 minutes, or you might call them and only have 2 minutes of their time. So we're going to share back. So choose somebody in your group who's also going to do that share back for everyone. And then again, it's the same. So just find your group. Your group's going to correspond with your room number. So if you're in breakout room 1, you're in group 1, etc., etc. Do folks have any questions before we begin? Okay, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to open up the breakout rooms again. And I'm just going to combine 2 breakout rooms because there's only some people left. Let me see. Room 2. Okay, so there should be at least 3 people in each group. There's one group of 4. So I'm going to open the rooms and you can go ahead and jump in.
I'm not sure if I got assigned
Oh, I will put
because
you.
I came in late. I'm sorry.
Yep, no worries.
Yeah, same, I think.
All right. All right, thanks for taking some time to strategize and come up with some narratives. Now we're going to share back. So each group will have 2 minutes to pitch their narrative story to a change maker who has the ability to meet the demands you're asking for. So tell us your impactful story. Any volunteers to go first? Otherwise, we're going to
Count me in.
All right, Max, I knew I could count on you.
All right. I'm here repping group 3 today. Maya, Rashad, Vanessa, and myself. And we are talking with local legislators about funding for local journalism, specifically around civic info and elections coverage for communities overlooked by legacy media. I see Mike is very excited about that. Hell yeah. So we wanted to talk with our local legislators today about a problem that's impacting underserved communities in our state. You know, it's some sort of combination of New York, New Mexico, and California, and Pennsylvania, of course, just to add some flair. We've been noticing that this challenge specifically is impacting communities with limited English language capacity and lower income and smaller communities in rural areas and parts of our states. What we need is a dedicated long-term fund to support a fellowship program that has demonstrated help for local journalists get their careers started and strengthens news in rural communities. And we also want to be able to support, ask you to support local research into our local information ecosystem needs across our states in the long term. So not only now, but over time, we can be tracking the impact of our work to make sure that folks get the information that they need in the format that they need it in. And I'll take the check in small bills. Yeah, it should be great. Thanks.
Demand granted. You have convinced us. Good job, group number 3. Thank you so much. All right, who would like to share back next?
I can go with group 2.
Thank you.
You all are the school board, and I'm here to talk with you about the lack of student journalists in the Bay Area. 90% of public schools in the Bay Area don't even have a student newspaper. In contrast, I don't have the latest numbers, but I think 90% of private schools do have a student newspaper. This is a problem because student papers create opportunities for public school students to engage in their communities and empowers them to be storytellers. It teaches them how to be active participants in our democracy. Let's go ahead and fund a student newspaper at every school. It'll only cost, I don't know, $100. We'll figure it out, which is a fraction of what we're spending on curriculum right now. Can you board members work alongside me, students, educators, and parents to make this happen?
Love it. Who supports a student newspaper? All right, I think you won the crowd over. Raise your hand if you were part of your high school newspaper. Anyone? Anyone? All right, yes, the prelate. It's pretty bad, but oh, I see Rashad's in there too. All right, high school newspaper nerds. Thank you, Julia. Who else wants to go next? Where's group number 1?
I can share from group 1.
Thank you.
Awesome. I was in group 1 with Diamond and Sanjay. I came in pretty hot with feelings about propaganda, so that's where we went. I don't know how well this is going to line up with the pitch format, but we talked about the propensity of local media, TV news stations in particular, to go with single source stories, quoting cops and taking a real pro-cop stance. So we talked about a target audience that kind of a blanket approach. News leaders definitely are part of the target audience, creating an environment of shame. We talked about an education campaign for the wider community, talking about how it has specific effects on over-policed communities, and then but also effects on all of us when this is the approach, the deference that we take to police and the funding that we give to them, and then also funders as a potential audience to create an incentive structure for better coverage. So one of the tactics that we talked about was working with a local anti-racist organization to publish like a weekly report card. How many articles did each station produce that were on crime and policing in this week, and how many of those quoted somebody who wasn't a cop, and just kind of like just putting that information out there, and then linking that to like some of these educational pieces, like this is what happens to us when our news coverage is so pro-cop, and so this is how we can learn together. So we definitely talked a lot about my community, but yeah, Sanjay and Diamond, if there's any like broader things that you wanted to weigh in with, I'll leave it there.
No, I think that was great.
Well, you know I'm gonna snap for that, because in Philly we are trying to do the same. TV stations are pretty bad. They're all bad. The radio station, the newspapers. It's tough out there, but I love this idea of an education campaign and the report card. That's so good. We're gonna have to talk more about that after this. Thank you, group number 1. And I think group number 4 still has to go. Or is our group number 5? Group number 5? Yes.
Yes, we're group number 5. We created a pitch, a story about the importance of funding local journalism for other funders. I work for a funder. I've been thinking about this a lot because this is exactly what we're trying to do. And I work for MacArthur Foundation, and we're trying to also convince funders that don't already fund journalism that they should be funding journalism. So we aimed it at topic-specific funders that maybe fund education or health, but don't want to get into the journalism waters. And what we need is an asset-based frame the impression that something is dying seems like a lot of work to try to, bring it back. But what we decided was we need to show that not only is journalism, these kind of newer ways of reaching impacted people exist. They're exciting, they're strong. You might not know about them because your local news diet might look a certain way, but there is all of this energy going on, and there's a real need for philanthropy to support it in the long term, not just supporting a pilot or a short-term project, but that in fact local news, civic-minded, democracy fueling news has always been subsidized in some way. So we need to kind of really, if we want to see a strong community, we need to do that. And we also talked about how there's kind of a virtuous cycle of kind of social movements and journalism doing very distinct things, not in the appropriate ways, but we need both. And to kind of visualize how movements benefit from having investigations and journalism benefits from advocacy. And if funders are interested in a topic, they should really look at both.
I love it. Liberating resources, right? That's the name of the game. We can liberate tax dollars. We can liberate resources in our newsroom for better pay, right? And we can also talk to philanthropists to siphon some of that money towards a real asset. All right, thank you so much, group number 4. So I'm going to share our demands because, we're a media power collaborative and we got some demands. And I tried to capture what you said more or less. But if we were to go public today with our demands, we want a dedicated long-term fund for a fellowship program that's demonstrated it can support the careers of media workers and build capacity for rural area newsrooms. We want a student newspaper at every school. We want an education campaign for newsrooms to end propaganda and a weekly report card about propaganda to demonstrate the problem. And we want philanthropy to fund journalism. That should say, if you don't already, it's typo, because it's an asset, not because it's dying, because it's an asset that can effectively reach impacted people. What do we think of our manifesto? Yes. All right, I see some people cheering for it. That's exciting. These are all stories, right, that make up the dominant narrative that we're trying to build, right? So these are the small stories that we tell to reach an overarching dominant narrative, right? Which is that we need to preserve, to fight for, to fund local journalism. And we need to do a better job at making it accessible to different communities and to make it less racist and detrimental or reduce the harm in our communities. So I'm going to pass it off to one of my colleagues to talk about next steps. And I think we're right on track for time. Maybe I'll go back just a minute since we do have a little extra time to show what we were going to show, which is the Civic Info Consortium. I'm just going to read it real quick because we're doing pitches, right? New Jersey's local news is disappearing and public can't get info they need. News and info is crucial to civic health of our communities. We all have a stake. Academic research, surveys, personal testimonials. I was telling group 3 that the Center for Cooperative Media did a lot of research about local news in New Jersey that was really helpful. And then our call to action was to pass a specific bill. The result was it created the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium in 2018 with $7 million in grants, and now the largest media fund in New Jersey. There's a picture, folks lobbying, advocating in Trenton. And you can see some of the frames here. Fix New Jersey's local news crisis, our community, our voices, bring back local news. So again, when we talk about art and signage, we have to make our message clear. We also had cool buttons. I still have those buttons, by the way. And then with Media 2070, media is a system built on anti-Black racism that helps to uphold a white racial hierarchy. Media reparations are necessary to help create a fair, just media system. There's a boatload of academic research. It might be in the chat if it's not, but do read the Media 2070 essay. That is a piece of evidence and research in of itself. And the call to action that we have is to the FCC to do an investigation, study the history of racism and FCC policymaking, reparative funds from the government, media corporations, and philanthropy. And the result is Black in the Newsroom film, which is available online if you haven't seen it. It's 15 minutes, but I really encourage you to check it out. And for folks who are in New York, like Max, we have a really amazing event coming up, which maybe Diamond can pitch, the Black Future Newsstand. We have the pledge to care for newsrooms and a petition to the FCC. And again, if you search this hashtag Black Future Headlines, you'll see a whole bunch of really cool headlines from the future we want to build and see. So I just wanted to go back to that so we didn't miss it since we have a little extra time. Diamond, did you want to say something about the Black Future Newsstands?
Yeah, I was just going to drop in the chat that we can share materials when we start doing press releases for it, but we will be activating a physical Black Future newsstand in Harlem the week of Juneteenth at the Schaumburg Literary Festival. So we'll make sure this information gets around to folks that joined us today, but we're very excited to see those headlines come into reality.
Cool. I'm not sure who's doing this part, but I'm gonna pass it off.
I'll do this part. We are a couple minutes past now, so thank you all for staying just a little bit longer. Mike dropped off, I think. I don't know. We'll catch him later. We'll be in touch about the next MPC meeting. We're thinking about a deeper dive on narrative strategy. I am going to drop a link to a survey that when y'all have 5 minutes, please do take a moment to let us know about this session and also help us shape the next one. We will also send this and links to the case studies in a follow-up email. So for now, thank you all for joining us so much. This was such a rich discussion and also really fun. So thank you all for joining us and hope y'all have a really beautiful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Yay.